Good morning. My name is Karel Heijnert. Thank you for introducing me, Dr. Hisham. I'm honored. Oh, sorry. I'm honored to be here and speaking to you. It's a great event, Cairo Water Week. I think any country should have it. I'm a water person, so I love these kind of events. But it's not only about water. It's water is such an element in our societies that it immediately also is about economy, politics and whatever. What I want to do is I want to take you out of the Nile Basin for a few slides and talk a bit about some of the transboundary issues that we face in the Netherlands. Maybe not as magnificent and huge and scary sometimes as a basin like the Nile Basin, but I think it's some interesting elements that I want to highlight. And then I want to take you back to the Nile Basin and also discuss some of the issues that we have encountered in our previous work in the Nile Basin, because it's an interesting and important example of a big water problem where the competition between the different countries, but also the cooperation plays an important role. So what could cooperation do for you? And if you think about transboundary river management, I think it's always important to you talk about different countries, also within a country it's always difficult already to understand what is actually the issues you're facing, what are the potential solutions and their impacts. If you talk about different countries on the same river, the same principle applies. If you don't understand what is the issue and what are potential solutions, I think it's very difficult to come up with solutions. There should be a kind of technical fundament. I know it's politics plays an important role, but the technical aspects, the socio-economic aspects, what works, what doesn't work, how does it affect the economy, there should be a kind of common understanding about that. And then information also plays an important role. I think in the Nile Basin between Egypt and Sudan, there's a great example, the Permanent Joint Technical Committee, that shares information. I will come back to that later in my talk. Without that kind of sharing of information, you can also not share plans. You cannot do cooperative water management in a river basin. I think that's key too. And the last thing, well, you can say many things, but a last important thing I want to mention here is that, okay, it's the Cairo Water Week, we talk about water issues, but often, and especially in transboundary context, water issues cannot be just solved by water solutions. Water shortage, there may be a trade-off between countries in socio-economic terms, in other terms, so you have to look at the wider spectrum, and it goes beyond, for example, my capacity as a civil engineer. It's always, not always, but it's important to look at different aspects, especially when you think about trade-offs in terms of water shortages. Okay. Let's take a step into the Netherlands, far away. We are a delta country like Egypt. We've three more bigger transboundary rivers flowing into the country. The Rhine is maybe most known to you, and we used to have especially flooding and water quality issues there. There's a very well working committee along the Rhine between Switzerland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and we more or less, well, we're on the same page. Flooding is a different beast than water shortage, I must admit. But I want to take you to the south of the country, on the border with Belgium, and there we have the Schelde River. And the Schelde River is actually the navigation channel to Antwerp. Antwerp is a big harbor in Belgium. Rotterdam is the biggest harbor in Europe. It's in the Netherlands. Antwerp is the second. There's fierce competition. But all the ships, these big ships, have to pass a river which is flowing through Holland. It's also the last, how do you call it, untamed estuary in the Netherlands. We didn't close it because of the shipping. So it's a natural area. And there's serious flood issues. So flood protection is of serious concern there. So we have these three elements: flooding, economy, really big, and nature. And to give you some background, in a sense you can see it more or less the Nile basin the other way around. I will explain to you. So the harbour of Antwerp is very important for Belgium. 5% of their GDP, 3% of the jobs are actually in the harbour. But well, it's a long time ago, 400 years ago, 500 years ago. In this competition, we closed that harbour for 200 years by not dredging the river, by closing it. And even 200 years ago, 150 years ago, we threatened to do that again. So what I want to say is actually that fact, that mistrust that was created in that period lives up to today. So the Belgians don't trust us completely with how we manage their river. They see it as their river because it's bringing the ships to their biggest harbour. And in order to grow that economy, the channel has to be deepened all the time. So every now and then the ships get bigger and there's dredging. And dredging has impacts for flooding and for nature. And what you saw that in the past these discussions were always political. It's mostly politicians talking to each other, and I think politicians are really important. They representing our societies. So they were talking to each other, and the last round about this how to dredge, what are the compensating measures, took 25 years to come to a decision. And the recent one, which happened over the past 10 years, actually the politics in both countries said, well, we've seen this happening several times. We think it's better to first start with a technical discussion and really look at the alternatives and then have a political discussion. Some similarities which would happen around the GERD in the Nile basin. And then it was possible to solve and come to a conclusion in 5 years. It doesn't mean that is easy, because what had to happen is that, we are this country which in the Netherlands which is flooded regularly, well, in the past. And especially in the south part of the country, there was a history of a big flood in the 50s. So people are fiercely against giving land back to the river, actually. And what needed to happen as part of this treaty is to give back that, to take away a levee and flood part of the area. So this ended up in a huge political riot in the Netherlands. Small issue becoming very big politically, but because there was this agreement that there would be a discussion about the technical solution was on the table, the politicians actually stuck to it, and they implemented well, this small measure which was made a big political thing. So I think here making a choice, well, any process goes differently, but making a choice of paying enough attention early enough in the political process to technical aspects and what works, and also socio-economic aspects and what works is really important to make some progress. Let's go to the Nile. This is a map. It's actually satellite images. A colleague of mine has collected all the satellite images that have been made of the world. And if you then look over time, over the last 30, 40 years, you can look at the world and see over time what used to be land and is now water, reservoirs for example, or coastal erosion, and what used to be water and is now land. it's the Aqua Monitor. It gives a very interesting picture of the world. But with that as the background, I want to zoom in to the Grand Renaissance Dam, like Professor Ares has also done, and share some of the thoughts that come out of the work we've done previously and recently. And I don't pretend to say, well, this is the solution, because I'm not from the basin, so I will look at some results. I will share some ideas and what I see in the data. And you will see quite some similarities with the talk that Professor Ares has given. So we talk about, there's many reservoirs, but actually you talk about the balance between Lake Nasser and the reservoir that will be formed behind the Renaissance Dam. And I want to show you a sequence of images that to illustrate something which I think is important here. I'm not pinning it down, but yesterday we talked about climate change as an important driver for change, and also urbanization was mentioned, but especially climate change. But if you look at the basin, apology for the Sudanese part of the audience, because I forgot Kashim Al-Kirba here. But what I see is this: in 1970, there were some dams. In 1970, the big dam, the high dam, was built, which was really important for the agriculture in Egypt, agricultural production. Then it was silent for quite some time. And then in 2009, 40 years later, 2 dams were completed. Tekesa Dam in Ethiopia, these are not small dams, and the Merowe Dam in Sudan. 4 years later, Rosiris Dam was heightened, so more storage was created behind Rosiris. 3 years later, the Atbara dams were completed on the Atbara river system, so the 2 branches of the Atbara flowing into, well, Kashim Al-Kirba actually. And now we talk about the Grand Renaissance Dam on the border with Sudan. So you see, over 10 years, this is a rapid development. So we can talk about climate change and we can talk about urbanization, but there are other developments that are really important that we have to keep in mind. And that's living in a transboundary catchment. In a catchment, you have to deal with those changes. But so I want to stress this point that it's something which is all, let's say, man-made, which is going on, and it's really affecting decision making in the basin. Now, what I like Professor Ares, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you talk a bit about the impact of the GERD, and in order to do that properly, it's always good to use numbers, real numbers that simulate reality, so data and also model results, to illustrate certain points, like Professor Ares has been doing. And I don't think it's an issue to reiterate these things, because I think there are a few important points were made in the previous talk. So, not spend much time on it, but in order to quantify effects on water resources and socio-economics, of course you start with data, but then you use models to more or less predict the future and also predict impacts of interventions. So we use a water resources model which has been established over the years, which contains a lot of information, called Ribasim, and we use, because it's not just about water, it's also about economic impact, and you can use different models for that. And we use the agricultural sector model for Egypt, which more or less like an accepted way of establishing the impact of water on economy. And if you look at hydropower, you have to do some more. So what I try to do, and what my colleagues has done in the past, is translate the impact of the GERD and the way you manage it, the way you fill it, in economic terms also, in the end. We'll come back to that. And some hydrological background, just a few points, which I think are important to think about the measures. So the storage volume from empty to full of the GERD is 74 billion cubic meter. Well, Professor Aris said 51. We use a slightly longer period, 49, we say like around 50 billion cubic meter flows through the Blue Nile at that location. So 1.5 times the annual flow of the river will be stored in the reservoir. And the flow in the Blue Nile is about 60% of the flow that reaches Lake Nasser. What I think is also important is but I think it's important to stress that again. There's quite a large variation in the flows. So it's not that this is a constant flow. With the GERD it will become more constant, but there's a large variation. So plus or minus 50% or more at the side of the Blue Nile. Even the inflow of Lake Nasser, there's still a large variation, because the White Nile might be quite stable, but the Blue Nile is the big contributor, and the Atbara, they are very influenced by the rainfall season. With dams, that's all going to change completely. But especially when you fill the dam, you have to take that into account. And this illustrates this. This is the top graph shows the annual flows. And the bottom graph shows, if you subtract the average flow from all those numbers, you can see droughts and flood periods, so high flows, low flows. And in the circle you see the 1980s drought. So it may not be the driest individual years, but it was a long period of drought, which even if you have big reservoirs like Lake Nasser and the GERD Dam in the future, might still be a challenge. And the question is, of course, how is it going to change in the future? In principle, dams help you to deal with the variability in the river. So if climate change, and there's a suggestion there, is climate change is increasing the variability, dams may be helpful. And that's the way why we use dams. And of course, this is 115 years, 100 years, 115 years. And you could look over longer periods of time by mathematically creating synthetic series that show those patterns over time. I just mentioned that, so we'll not use it in this presentation. And the last point I want to mention is that in what I'm going to show you, we assume for now that the water use in Sudan is 18.5 billion cubic meter, and that's more or less according to the 1959 agreement. And I'm not going to debate whether that is the current situation or not, but let me say this: that with the big dams that have been built over the past 10 years, which will take away the variability of the river, it's very likely that this number will be reached very soon, because it becomes much easier with a fairly constant flow in the Atbara River, but also in the Blue Nile, to develop irrigation systems. So in the simulations we assume that. By the way, this is, I think, also the challenge for the future between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia, to how to tackle the development in the basin. Now I'm going to show you a sequence of slides, which I must admit I copyrighted it from a very respected person. But better to copyright something or to copy something from good from somebody else than to make something bad. But I want to show you the filling of GERD to a degree. So we have the high dam, and we have some dams in Sudan. And the issue is, of course, that if this would be one country, then adding another dam, you could operate. I think in the next talk we'll hear about the Colorado River, and there you have dams in one country. Okay, there's also two countries, but here there's a competition in a water scarce environment between countries. And what you'll see is, if you start filling the reservoir, Lake Nasser will inevitably go down, and the GERD reservoir will go up. But what you need to ensure, of course, is that that sufficient water, or as much as possible, but sufficient in terms of the water requirements for Egypt, you will still be able to release that from the high dam. And for Ethiopia, it's of course, much of the talk is about filling the reservoir. So how high? But of course, in fact, it's about how much energy can you generate during filling. You can also generate energy at a lower level in GERD. So I think it's important not to look at to fill the reservoir till 640. That's the maximum reservoir, but look at the energy generation of the dam. So that's for Ethiopia, but also for Egypt. The level in Lake Nasser will go down because of filling, and it will, in the future, it will always be lower than it has been. Well, under the same circumstances with GERD, it will be lower in Lake Nasser than without GERD. That's the effect of having another reservoir upstream, which means that the hydropower production in Egypt will go down. And it will not recover. I'm going to illustrate the filling on the basis of looking at the dry period and an average period. So here we look at the 25-year series without Lake Nasser. Maybe you recognize it from the previous presentation that with the development in upstream development in water use, if you have the 1980s drought back, and this is the 1980s drought, and you look at Lake Nasser, you will start to see release reductions that are necessary, quite significant actually. So that is important to take that, put it in your head, that's the starting point. Now we're going to look at if you would fill GERD in that period. And first we're going to look at the filling period of 5 or 10 years. 6 has been a discussion, but I'll look at 5 and 10 years of filling. And what you see actually, this will happen to the lake level of Lake Nasser. And at the bottom, 147, that is the point where you cannot release water anymore. So you will see a release shortage. And you see that due to filling of GERD, the water level will go down significantly. And there will be a severe increase of potential water shortages if filling takes place in this dry period, the 1980s, which is not likely to reoccur, but it might reoccur in this period. And you see also that if you look at the 5 and 10 year filling period, the difference between the energy production in Ethiopia is not much. So on the one hand, if you would fill in the 1980s drought, filling in 5 or 10 years, doesn't make a big difference in water shortage for Egypt. And it doesn't make a big difference in generation of hydropower for Ethiopia. So for that particular case. But the hydropower at Lake Nasser will decrease by about 25%, 25%. Don't pin me down on the numbers, but I mean the order of magnitude is what it is. Now if you look at average conditions, it looks more like this. So what we've done, we look at the historic period that more or less in the first 10 years of that period, there's 25 years, has average flow inflow into Lake Nasser. And we look again at filling. And the point I want to make here, because you see that filling also under average conditions brings down Lake Nasser to low levels. And actually, and I'm not a piano player, I can't do two things at the same time. It actually also causes water shortages. And so not only under say more extreme droughts, but also under average conditions, you might create water shortages depending on the filling strategy that you choose. Come back to that in a minute. So filling in an X number of years, in my view, is clearly a non-cooperative scenario, because you don't take into account the hydrology of the river in the Blue Nile at that point. So you don't fill slower in dry periods, you don't fill even quicker in wet periods, which is possible. You just fill in an X number of years. And if that coincides with the drought period, you may end up in serious water shortage in Egypt. And I think, looking at the river with that kind of variability, it is really not a wise approach to follow that. I mean, we're looking at a natural system where the flow could be 50% more, 50% less in different years. So I think it's strongly advised not to go for a fixed filling period, but go for a cooperative filling period. I will come back to that, which may also end up in a 5 or 6 year filling period. But if it's a drought that coincides with filling, you adapt yourself. That is following the rules of nature. So going to more cooperative or adaptive filling strategies. So adaptive in the sense that you adjust the way you fill the reservoir to the amount of water in the river, or the water availability in your system of reservoirs. So you could think of different flavors. For example, you could think about filling with a percentage of the inflow into the GERD reservoir. You can say, for example, well, I fill with 10% of what's annually of this year, what's coming in the river that I use for filling. Or you can agree that there is always a minimum outflow from GERD reservoir. So if Sudan and Egypt have a requirement of a minimum outflow, that could be negotiated with Ethiopia, in theory, and then that could be agreed as a minimum outflow. That's also a cooperative scenario, which there's a kind of logic in it, because you talk about satisfying the water requirements downstream. And a third one, which I think is the most cooperative one, is for Egypt. It's really important, and I set aside the hydropower production in Lake at the high dam. But for Egypt, it's really important to have sufficient water in Lake Nasser to irrigate the country. And if Lake Nasser falls to dangerously low levels and GERD has filled up, you actually would like to see releases, in a truly cooperative fashion, releases from the GERD reservoir to Lake Nasser to supplement the level there to be able to still irrigate. And of course, you need to agree, probably, maybe you have to reduce the outflow from Egypt, and you have to monitor it very well. And Sudan, of course, plays an important role, because the water has to pass through Sudan. But that would be a truly cooperative manner. And I will show you some results of that analysis. And then I'll wrap up the filling part. So if we would apply this cooperative strategy, and we looked at two levels. 155 is below the turbine inlet, 160 is above the turbine inlet. This was what happened in a fixed filling period. I just want to give you a bit of a feeling. So you see that actually you're able to actually store more water in Lake Nasser. And I must say, this is the 1980s drought, and strategies have less impact here because the hydrology is more or less dominating what is happening in the reservoirs than when you look at average periods. But in this way you're able to reduce about 50% of the shortages for Egypt. But it comes at an expense. So Ethiopia, of course, has built a dam to generate power. If you release water to supplement Lake Nasser, you generate power at a lower level, and that costs you some energy. So the energy production will go down 20 to 30%. So it's not insignificant. But compared to the water shortages in Egypt, it might be very, very important. If you look at average conditions, you see this, that with a cooperative way of working, I think there's no release shortages under average conditions. So when you're not in these extreme droughts, and Professor Aros was mentioning that also, that the whole talk will be about how to deal with this low probability droughts in the end, but filling under average conditions may cause issues in Egypt. But if you apply the right filling strategy, cooperative filling strategy, it won't. And it comes at little expense for Ethiopia, because the impact is still there. So the hydropower production will go down 5 to 10%. So it's still there, but you're able to resolve the water shortages. Now, I will show you some numbers to get it, because the water numbers don't always give you the feeling for the magnitude of the issue. So please consider these numbers with care, but they give some indication of the impact in socio-economic terms. So in fact, by moving from this fixed filling scenario to the most cooperative scenario that you could ever imagine, you're able to reduce over, I assume, the 25-year filling period. So you fill in the first part, but looking over a 25-year period. On the average, you're about to reduce the impacts with about $1 billion US dollars a year in Egypt. Plus the fact that you don't have to import agricultural produce, and the associated unemployment that comes with a decreased agricultural production. And I'll let you make the computations yourself, but it's not 10,000 people or 100,000 people that will be affected by such a change. And the hydropower production, if you look at that, so the fixed filling period, so you're able to relatively quickly fill the reservoirs. And here we talk about the dry period. Under average conditions, this is much more balanced. So it's about 0.4 billion US difference in energy generation annually over that 25-year period. So 400 million. Under dry conditions. So in the end, you look in a normal period where you have a change of average dry and wet periods. So what I actually want to say here is that under drought periods, a filling strategy will help to reduce the impacts, but you can never fully mitigate the impacts. Even in the most cooperative scenario, you cannot, but you can really significantly reduce it. Under average and wet conditions, especially average conditions, cooperative strategy can avoid water shortages overall. And that's why I think, if you look at the benefits and the cost, that's why I think cooperative scenario, if you look at it from a helicopter point of view, an adaptive filling scenario is strongly preferred. But it needs to be made practical, because the benefits and the costs are not ending up in on the same table. So how to implement it? I think that is not something that technical people can do, but for sure this is the three-party discussion. And there's other means than water solutions that be able to solve this. Do I still have some? I have a few more slides and then I'm, okay. So I want to show you a little bit about normal operation. So after the reservoir has been filled, we can look at normal operation. So let's rerun the situation from 1900 to 2015, and in black you see the situation without GERD, and in red you see the situation with GERD. This is the top is the water level in Lake Nasser, and the bottom is the energy generation in Lake Nasser. And you see that overall the water level will go down, and also the energy production at Lake Nasser will go down. And the impacts are large in drought periods like the 1980s, but if you would average it over these 100 years, they are, yeah, maybe minor is not the right word, but they seem insignificant. But because they are concentrated in these short periods of drought, they are significant, they are important, and we need to deal with them. And many of the strategies that you use for filling, because this I want to say, actually if you can deal with the drought periods, and especially coming out of the drought, which is very similar to what you would do with first filling the reservoir, you're able to deal with normal operation. The focus should be there. And cooperative strategies, in a similar way as for filling, could mitigate those impacts. But there needs to be, of course, an international willingness to comply to that. And those cooperative strategies, they could include several elements. I mean, in my talk I highlight a few, but of course you can think about combinations. So establishing a minimum annual outflow from the GERD reservoir, always, or maybe under drought conditions. I think it's still quite elegant to agree a minimum level in Lake Nasser, and more comes that. Those kind of strategy elements are also give you also the possibility to deal with some of the uncertainties. So if we overestimated the water use in Sudan, it will automatically be visible in the water level in Lake Nasser. Then it will be higher than you expected. If you underestimate it, it will be the other way around. Or the losses in Sudan, in the river, or other developments. These cooperative strategies also give you the possibility to deal with uncertainties, besides and not having to make new agreements about how much water should go where. And of course, if you have a drought, you have to agree more or less in what order you're going to refill the reservoirs. Given the fact that you want to maintain the water availability, it seems likely to, well, maybe fill up the upper reservoirs first, if you can assure that the downstream water users get their share. Last slide. Into the future. I said something about climate change. So reservoirs help you to deal with the variability. But you see that they also change the hydrology of the river, and that is already happening at this moment. So with the GERD, with the Tekese Dam, with the Atmara dams, the hydrology of those very variable rivers has been changed forever. They more or less are able to, maybe the Atbara not yet, but they're more or less able to provide continuous flow. So adding other reservoirs upstream won't make a big difference for Sudan and Egypt, unless there is water development. If it's just used for hydropower, and if you solve the problem of filling and refilling after drought, the agricultural development, the water use development is the main thing. And that's the second point I point here. And that really goes beyond what technical people can do. This is much more political, of course. Agricultural water use development, not the issue that we have now with GERD, but the water use development is the main issue for the future. If the same trend of dam development, which I showed you in my previous slides, continues, which I assume will not, but if it, that's something you have to manage with the 3 countries in the basin. And this is the last point I want to make. So we talked quite a lot about cooperative water management, but the last point I want to make is that you cannot do cooperative water management, adaptive water management, if you don't know where the water is. So, come back to the permanent joint technical committee. That kind of mechanism between the two countries in 1959, but between the three countries, hopefully in the future, is really essential if you want to do a form of cooperative water management. Because if you don't know where the water is, how much water is used, you can also not manage it properly. And it should be transparent. This is a technical message, I know, and there's many political aspects to it, but I think that this is a key point. You can talk about cooperative water management, but you also need to know where the flow is going. You need to sort of agree about that. That's my last point. Thank you.